Before ghost stories became a way to frighten children, before we learned to fear the creak of floorboards or the flicker of a light bulb, there were spirits born from the very essence of life and death itself. Let's go back to the very beginning, before the legends were spun, to uncover the bone-chilling truth of what really walked among the living. In the heart of ancient China, there was a time when death didn't just signify the end of life, it was the beginning of something much darker. Long before our modern conceptions of ghosts and spirits, the people of China had already begun to understand that death could open doors to horrors unseen. It all started with the wild, unexplainable phenomena that terrified early villagers. In the depths of the mountains and thick forests, entire villages would vanish overnight, leaving behind nothing but abandoned homes and overturned graves. Some spoke of the hungry ghosts, souls trapped between the living and the dead, driven by an insatiable thirst for vengeance. But it was in the year 845 AD when something happened that would forever mark the legend of the first true horror. In the small village of Lianzhou, nestled among the hills of southern China, a series of inexplicable deaths spread panic throughout the community. People began to die under mysterious circumstances, found lifeless in their beds, their eyes wide open with terror. Local rumors spread like wildfire. The village was being haunted by a spirit that had returned with a vengeance, and it wasn't content with taking just one life. Then, one fateful night, a group of villagers went out to investigate the local burial grounds after hearing strange noises echoing from the hills. The graves were found torn open, the bodies face down in the soil, their limbs twisted in unnatural positions. The air around the burial site felt unnervingly cold, and the smell of decay hung thick, despite the freshness of the night air. No one dared to approach the graves for fear of angering whatever had caused this disturbance, but the sounds grew louder. Whispers of something darker lurking beneath the soil spread, and what had once been a quiet, rural village became a place of terror. Those brave enough to venture near the burial grounds reported hearing footsteps in the night, just out of sight, moving closer and closer until the unmistakable sound of a dry, raspy breath filled the air. For days, the village was paralyzed with fear. The few who had not already fled to safer areas were left in silence, their lives now caught in the grip of something far beyond their understanding. Something was awake in the hills, something that could not be explained by anything the villagers had known. The people soon learned that there were no easy answers, and not even the teachings of Taoist exorcists could keep the spirits at bay. In desperation, they turned to ancient rituals, those passed down by their ancestors, hidden in forgotten scrolls and whispered among the elders. The hope was simple. If they could appease the spirits with the right offerings, the curse would be lifted. But as the days wore on, it became clear that the spirit haunting Lianzhou was not something that could be dismissed with a simple ritual. The hungry ghost that roamed the hills was born from something much darker than anger or revenge. It was a manifestation of something primal, something that had once been human but was no longer bound by the rules of life and death. But something else was stirring beneath the surface. Long before the restless spirits began their haunting, there was a time when the people of Asia believed in the power of the unseen, spirits of the earth, the sky, and the dead. To the ancient Chinese, the world was not a realm divided between the living and the dead, but a continuous cycle where one could pass from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, only to return. The natural world was saturated with spirits, and it was common belief that everything, from the rocks in the river to the trees in the forest, was watched over by a deity or spirit. But even the strongest of beliefs sometimes reveal something darker beneath the surface. The origins of the hungry ghosts, the restless spirits that would haunt the earth, have been passed down through generations, and they tell of an age-old curse born from a broken harmony. These spirits were not born of pure vengeance, but from the ancient understanding that death, when unresolved, creates a cycle of suffering and pain that transcends time. The origins of these spirits are deeply rooted in a belief older than any written history, an understanding that certain souls, particularly those who died violently or unjustly, would return from the grave as a force of imbalance. It wasn't just a story. It was a warning that death was never truly final. In the misty fields surrounding the ancient cities, where the air seemed to thicken with secrets, people performed elaborate ceremonies to honor their ancestors. There, beneath the low-hanging branches of ancient trees, the villagers gathered at nightfall for rituals meant to appease the spirits. Candles flickered in the darkness as incense wafted into the cool night air, curling and dancing as though carried by unseen hands. The rituals were a way to maintain peace, an ancient reverence that kept the spirits content and the land fertile. The living and the dead were intertwined, and respect for the spirits was not only a duty, but a means of survival. In return, the spirits would watch over them, ensuring prosperity, health, and safety. Every year, the villagers performed these rituals with unwavering devotion. It was thought that if they offered enough, their loved ones would rest peacefully, and in turn, the spirits of the land would protect them from the forces of chaos. But there was always something unsettling about the rituals, something that made the hairs on the back of one's neck stand on end. The incense burned with a strange intensity, and the faint whispers in the wind never quite sounded like the voices of ancestors. As the ritual progressed, the villagers would sometimes notice a shift in the atmosphere, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The air would grow heavier, colder, and the faint sounds of distant cries seemed to echo through the fields, though no one dared acknowledge them. It was an unspoken rule that some spirits were too powerful to be appeased by simple offerings. For these spirits, the rituals were a mere formality. The elders would whisper in hushed tones about the ancient hungry ghosts, souls cursed to wander between worlds, driven by insatiable hunger for vengeance. The belief was that these ghosts were trapped in a state of perpetual dissatisfaction, unable to rest until they had claimed their due. The hungry ghosts were different from other spirits, fueled by a deeper hunger than mere nourishment. They sought justice, and their return was often a sign of the most profound injustice. It wasn't just the dead who were in danger. It was the living, too. It was said that these ghosts did not speak. They communicated through dreams, nightmares, and the shadows in the corners of rooms. Villagers would tell stories of nights when the wind howled through the trees and strange voices would call their names from the darkness. Sometimes, a family would notice food disappearing from the table, even though no one had touched it. Or they would hear faint, rasping breaths in the silence of the night, just outside their doors, just close enough to make their skin crawl. The belief in these spirits was not something that was easily dismissed. In fact, the ancient practices surrounding the hungry ghosts became even more elaborate as time passed, as the fear of these restless spirits grew. The hungry ghosts were feared not because they could be seen, but because they were so insidious, so subtle. They could slip between the cracks of everyday life, whispering from the shadows and feeding off the fear and uncertainty of the living. It wasn't until much later, during a particularly dark period in history, that the villagers' worst fears would be realized. An unsettling chill began to spread through the land as strange occurrences plagued the villages. People who had performed the rituals faithfully began to fall ill, suffering from nightmares so vivid they seemed to pull them into a waking, torturous dream. And as their health began to deteriorate, there was no sign of the spirits they had once honored. The hungry ghosts had gone silent, and with that silence came an eerie sense of foreboding. One night, as the wind picked up and the darkened skies threatened rain, a group of villagers ventured into the woods, hoping to find the source of their growing unease. It was there, in the deep quiet of the forest, that they found something that could not be explained, a circle of graves, the soil freshly disturbed, and the unmistakable marks of claws and scratching all around. It was the first sign that the rituals, once thought to protect them, were no longer enough. Something had awoken that could not be controlled, something darker than they could comprehend. And as the mist began to roll in from the hills, thickening the air with dread, the villagers knew the hungry ghosts were no longer bound to the grave. They had returned, but something else was stirring beneath the surface. It started with subtle disturbances, small shifts in daily life, barely noticeable at first. A child would be born with strange markings, skin too pale, almost translucent. Others would fall into fits or lose their ability to speak, staring blankly as though seeing something beyond human comprehension. At first, people dismissed it as bad luck or illness, but soon the pattern became undeniable. In the weeks after the village's last ritual, the unusual occurrences escalated. A mother gave birth to twins with gray skin and dark, unblinking eyes. One night, She awoke to their soft wail but found them silent, staring at the ceiling as if something unseen was watching them. The local healers could offer no explanation, whispering of restless spirits preparing the way for something worse. It wasn't just the children. The animals in the village began acting strangely. Cows stopped giving milk, chickens refused to roost, and dogs howled at the moon. These weren't random events. Something darker had awakened. People began falling ill with a sickness. Unlike any other, feverish, burning hot, but with a strange pallor and trembling limbs. Some mumbled in their sleep, speaking in tongues they couldn't remember upon waking. Nothing seemed to help, despite herbal remedies and purification rituals. As the sickness spread, strange markings appeared, thin red lines on the sick, like invisible claws had swiped across their skin. But there were no visible wounds. The marks weren't just on the afflicted. The village elders, those who had performed the ancient rituals, were also marked. One elder collapsed during a ceremony, his face pale and lips trembling, his hands cold. What terrified everyone most were the strange symbols etched into his flesh, unfamiliar and deep, as if burned by something unnatural. Then, during a village meeting, the room grew heavy with tension. A gust of wind blew through the windows, scattering papers and extinguishing candles, too deliberate to be a draft. In the silence that followed, a young girl, no older than 12, spoke up, her voice trembling. She spoke of shadows moving on their own, of whispers in the night, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. "I saw something," she whispered. "In the woods, at the edge of the village. It wasn't human." The room fell silent. The villagers knew the forest well, an ancient place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. For centuries it had been a place of death and decay, where restless spirits roamed. The thought that something unnatural had emerged from the woods was terrifying. The girl's words struck fear into the hearts of all. Was it possible that the spirits had crossed into the living world, seeking vengeance on those who had once appeased them? The village's ancient rituals, once thought to protect them, had only stirred something far more ancient and dangerous. Fear spread, and the villagers began to believe the hungry ghosts were real, their return heralded by the strange markings and sickness. The elders' condition confirmed their worst fear. Something far darker had awoken, and it was no longer confined to myth. Something ancient was at work. This was the first crack in the story. The first signs of true terror came in the form of death, but not the kind anyone could have predicted. It wasn't just the sudden disappearance of animals or crops withering away. It was the overwhelming sense that something ancient, something unseen, was crawling out from the depths to settle over the village. The whispers of hungry ghosts had transformed into a living nightmare. It began slowly. At first, the villagers noticed the strange deaths of their livestock. Cows stopped giving milk, chickens lay still in their pens, and pigs were found mutilated, their eyes wide in terror. There were no marks on the bodies, no signs of predators, just the unnatural, unexplained deaths. The more animals that died, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Soon the crops began to fail. Rice paddies once fertile became barren. Cracked earth. Tomatoes rotted on the vine before they could ripen. It was as though the land itself had turned against them, infected by a dark force. Farmers, once confident in their knowledge, reported crops growing twisted and deformed. The villagers spoke of a curse. As crops continued to fail, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just the earth that had changed. People began to fall ill in ways no healer could explain. Feverish sweats, dizziness, and fatigue ravaged them. At night, villagers woke gasping for air, as if invisible hands were choking them. The children grew pale and weak, muttering in their sleep in strange tongues. Even the remaining animals acted unnervingly strange, howling at the sky, as if aware of some terrible presence. Suspicion began to grow. Who or what had angered the spirits? Accusations flew. Perhaps it was the widow with her strange beliefs, or the young couple who didn't know the old rituals. The once respected elders were now seen as cursed. One evening, as the villagers gathered to discuss the strange happenings, a sharp wind swept through the square. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees, barely noticeable at first, but then it drew closer. The air grew colder, thick with decay. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the forest, followed by a high-pitched shriek, too alien to be human. The villagers froze, terror spreading. It wasn't just an animal in the forest. They weren't alone. Panic spread, some fleeing into their homes, others too, afraid to move. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sounds stopped. The night fell silent. From that moment, the village was never the same. The hungry ghosts had awakened, and now they walked among the living. And from there, everything grew darker. The land, the people, no one knew how to stop it. As the terror spread throughout the village, the people began to scramble for any means of protection, no matter how desperate or unproven. They knew that something far beyond their control had taken root in the land, and all their previous rituals, the ones that had once kept the spirits at bay, were failing. The hungry ghosts had broken free of their ancient bonds, and now the villagers were left to fend for themselves. The elders, now frantically combing through old scrolls and forgotten texts, revived every possible ritual they could remember. Garlic, salt, and other age-old charms were scattered around doorways, windows, and beds. It was said that garlic could ward off evil spirits, and salt could purify the space, pushing back the darkness that had begun to fill their homes. These measures, though primitive, were their last hope. The villagers adorned their homes with charms made of sacred herbs. They wrapped their children in protective amulets, and they clung desperately to every superstition they had ever heard. The nights became rituals in themselves. Candles burned well into the morning, and incense filled the air, thickening it with the smell of sweet-scented. Smoke meant to banish the malevolent presence. In secret, hushed gatherings took place behind closed doors, rituals passed down through generations but long since abandoned, now revived with trembling hands and whispered prayers. They spoke of invoking the ancestors, hoping their spirits would return to protect the living ones. Some even took to drawing protective symbols on the floors of their homes, in desperate attempts to trap the evil spirits before they could enter. But despite their best efforts, nothing seemed to work. The nightly wails grew louder, the shadows moved more frequently, and more villagers succumbed to the sickness, their eyes hollow and their minds lost in fevered dreams. Those who were once the strongest, the bravest of the community, were now reduced to trembling husks of their former selves. At the edge of the village, where the forest began to reclaim its ground, the most fearful ones spoke of the night when they saw something else, a figure, not of this world, standing at the threshold between the trees and the village, watching with hollow, empty eyes. That figure was always just out of reach, just beyond the light, but it was there, and it was watching. The desperation became palpable, and the sense of inevitability settled over the village like a suffocating fog. They had no more answers, no more rituals to perform. The people were simply waiting for the next horrific sign, the next inevitable wave of terror that would confirm the worst fears of. The villagers turned to their most sacred nights, the nights when the spirits of the dead were thought to walk the earth. They hoped that on those nights, if they performed the right rituals and offered the right sacrifices, the spirits would come to their aid. But with each passing night, the rituals became more frantic, the offerings more desperate. The sacred nights lost their sanctity, transforming into last-ditch attempts to stave off what was already here. It was clear now that whatever had come for them could not be stopped by these earthly measures. The ghosts were not to be bargained with. They were not interested in appeasement. And with each failed ritual, the fear deepened. In the end, it wasn't about protection anymore. It was about survival. That moment opened a door that should have stayed closed. The belief that death was not the end was more than just an old superstition. It was a harsh, cold truth for the people of the village. When someone died in the old ways, whether by violence, suicide, or an untimely death, their soul was said to become restless. And when the soul refused to move on, it was said to bring misfortune to the living, casting a shadow over the land. This was a truth that had been passed down through generations, and it was something the villagers understood deeply. The fear of the restless dead became even more pronounced when the deaths in the village began to escalate. Unnatural deaths that left the living with a chilling certainty that death was not the end. The hungry ghosts, the spirits who had once haunted ancient tales, were beginning to walk again. But these were not the spirits of those who had passed in peace. No, these were the souls of the unjustly taken, those whose deaths had been marked by pain, violence, or unfulfilled rage. Their spirits, unable to find rest, returned to haunt the living, and their actions grew darker with each passing day. When a villager died under suspicious or violent circumstances, it was not enough to simply bury them. The old ways dictated that certain measures had to be taken to ensure the soul was pinned down, trapped in its grave. These rituals were not performed out of respect, but out of fear that if the dead were not properly contained, they would rise again and bring suffering to those still alive. The elders had long known of these practices, but in the midst of the growing fear, even the most devout villagers began to question the effectiveness of these measures. It wasn't enough to simply bury the dead. They had to be bound to the earth, prevented from returning. Stones were placed atop the graves, sometimes so heavy that it took several men to roll them into place. Nails, spikes, and even wooden stakes were driven through the bodies, pinning them into their final resting places. The practice was gruesome, but it was necessary. It was believed that these measures would stop the dead from clawing their way out, preventing their spirits from walking free. As each new body was added to the growing number of graves, the villagers became more desperate. They began to perform these rituals with growing fervor, pushing deeper and deeper into their own superstitions. They believed that the dead were rising, returning from the grave to seek vengeance on the living. And the more they buried, the more they feared that death was not an escape. It was simply another step in a cycle that could never be broken. One evening, a particularly tragic death occurred, a young man who had been found hanging from a tree, his face frozen in terror. The villagers assumed it was suicide, a tragic end to a troubled life. But when they prepared his body for burial, something felt wrong. As they tried to prepare the body for the ritual, they discovered strange markings, dark, jagged scratches across his chest. These were no natural marks. It was as if something had clawed at his body from the inside, desperate to break free. Fear gripped the hearts of the onlookers. Was this a sign that the young man's death was unnatural? That he had been claimed by a spirit in his final moments? The burial ritual was carried out with haste. The stones were placed, the nails driven in, and the body sealed in the earth. The villagers did everything they could to prevent his spirit from returning. Yet, despite all the precautions, a sense of dread lingered in the air. There was an overwhelming sense that death had not finished its work, that the young man's spirit had not been properly contained, that it was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. As the days passed, strange occurrences began to take place near the burial site. The ground around the grave seemed to shift and move as though something was trying to claw its way free. The very earth trembled as though it too was frightened of what had been buried there. The village once again found itself wrapped in a suffocating blanket of fear. The villagers could not ignore the feeling that the dead were not truly gone. The hungry ghosts that had been whispered about for generations had found their way into the living world once again. They had been trapped in their graves, yes, but their anger and hunger had not dissipated. They were still there, waiting. The belief that death was not an end but merely a passage to something darker seemed to come alive in the village. The restless dead were not gone. They were simply waiting for the next person to awaken them, the next tragedy to give them reason to return. And with each new death, with each new burial, the sense of dread grew stronger, because some of the dead refused to stay buried. And then, on the darkest night, the earth trembled and something broke free. A shadow, both human and something darker, rose from the graves, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. It moved with a terrifying fluidity, shifting in and out of existence, its presence chilling the very air. The whispers started again, low and haunting, carried by the wind. Some say that creature still haunts the village, roaming the woods, waiting for the next soul to claim. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers in the dark, calling from the graves that should never have been disturbed.